Thanks, guys. All right, thanks for coming out. I'm pretty excited to show you what I have in store today. A bit about me. So Jenny introduced me pretty well. My name's Tilo Mitra on IRC. You might have seen me lurking around on IRC or on Twitter. I'm the guy who has a ton of event gestures, bugs filed against him. But I wasn't working on those. I was working on this presentation. So after this, I'll fix your bugs. So anyways, today I'm pretty excited to talk about building native Win8 apps using YUI3. So with regards to Win8, I'm no real expert, to be honest. What happened was a few weeks ago, we had this sprint to try to get YUI working on Win8. And one of the things that I was responsible for was making some sort of test infrastructure on the different Win8 JavaScript environments. And so I made this little app with the help of a lot of my team members. And it essentially ran through all of YUI unit tests. So while making this, I picked up a lot of stuff. And that's what I'll be sharing with you today. I just want to go through what I'm going to cover in this talk at a high level. So we'll start off by talking a bit about Windows 8 and IE10. Then I'm going to talk about WinJS, which is this JavaScript runtime that allows you to make native apps using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then I'll connect the dots, and I'll talk about how we can use WinJS and YUI together. And I have some demo. I have a lot of code here that we can play around with. And finally, we'll go to questions. Also important is what I'm not going to be talking about today. And mostly this is because I don't know too much about these. But I have links here. So when you get the slides, you can just click on these, and they'll take you to the respective pages. So I'm not going to talk about in-app purchases. I'm not going to talk about how to package and submit Win8 apps. And I'm going to go into Visual Studio. I'll go into how to debug apps. But I'm not a Visual Studio expert. In fact, I'm a noob. So just take that with a grain of salt. Cool. So Windows 8. I never thought I'd be up here talking about Windows. Just out of curiosity, who's played around with Windows 8 here? OK, so a bunch of people. How long did it take you to close an application? So it took me a long time to figure this new OS UI at least out. But there's actually been a lot of positive feedback, a lot of negative feedback also, to be honest. But the truth is that Windows 8 is gaining momentum, and it's kind of obvious. So I have a couple of tweets here that I just got in the last maybe 72 hours. One from Daring Fireball, that a Twitter app recently reached its API limit. And then Windows 8 store apps just recently hit 13,000 apparently. I think when it came out, end of last month, there were about 2,000 apps on there. And so there are a lot of apps that are coming out. So I recently found out that Google has a Windows 8 app. There's an app from Netflix that's out there. That looks pretty nice. And then there's a lot of other third-party apps that are coming out there, right? Food Network, Vimeo, CBS, et cetera. So with apps comes opportunity. And one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk is because Windows 8 has this user interface that's actually common across desktop and mobile devices, right? So as a developer, you could potentially target more customers. Now let's talk a bit about YUI3. So in YUI 3.7.3, we added support for Windows 8. And Eric F. wrote this really nice blog post outlining exactly what was in that release. I particularly liked this line. We gave ourselves 10 days, which included weekends, to get the job done. We were able to add support for all these new environments very quickly because of YUI's architecture. And that's really true. As we go on in this talk, you will realize that because of YUI's sort of modular architecture, it's very easy to use it in this new environment, even though this environment didn't really exist like a few months ago. So with that, I'll jump into Windows 8 and talk about a couple of points that maybe you know about, maybe you don't. I'm not sure. So the first is this thing, which really confused me. What's the difference between Windows 8 and this WinRT thing that I keep hearing about, right? So the difference is Windows 8 is this operating system that can run Windows apps, as in the traditional legacy Windows apps in the desktop mode, and also new Metro apps, which are the tiled apps, right? And WinRT is kind of like Windows 8 Lite. It's designed primarily for tablets. So for example, the Surface is, I think, called Surface RT. And the point here is that the Surface can run these new Metro-like apps, but they can't run the desktop apps. So really what we're going to talk about today is how to build WinRT apps that can run on tablets and that can run on desktops in the new Metro sort of user interface. So that's an important distinction to make, actually. Now, in Windows 8, there are 4 JavaScript runtimes, as opposed to Windows 7, which only, I think, from my understanding, had 1 JavaScript runtime, which was like IE. So in Windows 8, you have IE10 Desktop, which is the standard IE that we've come to know and love and hate. Then there's IE10 Start. I'll get into these. I'll show some pictures so you understand. But there's IE10 Start Screen, which is the IE10 in Metro mode. Then there's a web view that you can open up if you're making a C# app. So in Windows 8, you can make apps either using C# or using web languages, right? So if you make a C# app, you can open up a web view. And finally, there's this WinJS environment, which also runs it executes JavaScript using the Chakra IE10 JavaScript engine. So this is what I'll skip the IE10 Desktop because I think we're all pretty familiar with that. But this is what I mean when I say IE10 Metro mode, right? This is what it looks like. The deal here is it's more restrictive than IE10 Desktop, and the key difference there is it doesn't have support for plugins, so such as Flash, Silverlight, ActiveX, etc. The star there is because when Microsoft did this, they realized, oh, there are some legacy sites out there that use Flash, and we don't want those sites to just break. So if you are a big legacy site and you email Microsoft and get on that compatibility list, then your Flash will work in Metro mode. But for regular developers, you don't have any Flash. Then there's this web view mode. And haven't really played around with this too much. We ran Yeti on it, and so we know stuff works in there. But this is only really if you're a C# developer. What you can do is, I think you can use XAML, using that syntax there, and pop down a web view. The web view is very similar to like web views as you would expect on iOS or Android. You can point them through a source. Inside, so the page that loads up inside this web view obviously does not have access to on-device APIs, and it has limited HTML5 support. So for example, it doesn't have geolocation, it doesn't have IndexedDB, and a few other features. There's some docs on that. But the really interesting one is this one, which is WinJS. So what it is a restricted IE10 runtime with access to native APIs. When I say restricted, I mean not all the DOM APIs are available, and there's some more documentation about that. Essentially allows developers to create WinRT apps using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And there are a lot of other restrictions, but one of the main ones that we ran into was that when you build these apps, all scripts and styles must be available on device, so they have to be packaged locally. And this becomes important when we're working with YUI, so we'll get into that a bit more later. So I want to dig a little deeper into WinJS specifically now. So like I said, it uses IE10 to process HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It uses that Chakra JavaScript engine that I think IE10 uses. Scripts and styles bundled locally. It doesn't have JSON-P. It supports cores over XML HTTP request. And it has this concept of a safe inner HTML. So I'll get into this in the next slide. But you can essentially dump any HTML that you want. And you have access to this traditional DOM APIs, but you also have access to these new namespaces, capital Windows and WinJS, and that gives you access to on-device APIs. So when I mean safe inner HTML, all DOM APIs which end up appending things to the DOM, whether it's inner HTML, outer HTML, inner text, etc., go through this toStatic HTML method in this environment. And essentially that will only allow certain markup to filter through. I have a link there. It's a huge list of what's allowed and what's not. But essentially, you can have inline JavaScript. So here you can see in this example, if that was my inner HTML that I was putting through, the scripts would get taken out. The inline JavaScript there on onClick would get taken out. And the only thing that would get appended is span click me. So this is actually a good thing that they've done, just to make it safer. And there were some small instances in YUI where we were doing something like this. It was pretty easy to take care of, but it's something to keep in mind. OK, so let me talk a bit about a WinJS app. So you open Visual Studio, and you say new project, and you say I want to create a WinJS project. What you essentially end up with is something that looks like this. You have a default.html file, which links to default.js, default.css, and it also links to a bunch of WinJS references. OK, so what do all these mean? So the default.html, I'll get into this a little later, but think of it as a shell around your application. Default.js is where you contain all your app lifecycle code. I'll show some code about that in a bit too. In WinJS, you have the full screen view, but you also have media queries because you can snap apps to the left or the right of the screen. So you can kind of multitask. So default.css has some of those media queries built in. And then we get to the WinJS side. And in WinJS, again, everything in WinJS is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So a new app would have UI.css, which contains all the styles to make your app look and feel native. Then there's base.js, which has a lot of it has class management tools and things that YUI already offers. But if you weren't using a library, you'd be using whatever's in base.js. It has UI.js, which is where all the WinJS widget views are contained. So all the classes related to a user interface. And then if you're making some sort of master detail application, you get this navigator.js, which maintains navigation. So I'll dig into some of these a little deeper. Obviously, you need more than one page in your application, right? So if you want to add a page, each new page that you add, or in mobile terms, each new view, I guess, is its own set of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you wanted to add 2 new views here, master view and detail view, I would have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for each of those. Now those pages, for example, master view, which has masterview.html, masterview.css, masterview.js, to me, they adopt a model view controller architecture. So the view is represented by whatever's in HTML and whatever's in the CSS. The controller is whatever's in that JavaScript file. And the model is usually something that's available globally. It's usually defined in some global space, so that all the different views have access to it. Let's go back to this default.html, because this is a little interesting. So in WinJS, when building these apps, you're essentially making single-page apps. So all your pages are contained in this default.html shell. This shell has no user interface, but if you say navigate from page A to page B, the contents of page B get appended to default.html, and the existing content in there essentially gets removed. So default.html has this shell, and if you want anything if you have any scripts or styles that you want access to throughout your app, you can put that in default.html. So here you can see you have default.html, but the actual page the user is viewing might be homepage.html. They don't actually know the default.html is there. So homepage.html gets loaded along with its scripts and styles, and then that gets placed inside this shell. So the way you do that in Windows, in WinJS at least, is in default.html. If you look at the code, and I'll show you some code later, but there's barely any code in default.html. Essentially, all it has is something like this, and it says that when this app launches, I want the homepage to be homepage / just a typo there. It should say homepage / homepage.html. But that essentially, when the app launches, that gets processed, and homepage gets appended to the default.html page. Now, default.js is what does that figures that out when the app launches. That's where you place all lifecycle events and all code related to the app lifecycle management. So, for example, there are a bunch of events that fire over the lifecycle of an app. Activated when the app is launched, loaded after DOM content loaded fires, ready when the app is ready to use, checkpoint fires when the user is navigating away from your app and your app gets placed on the background, and unload is when your app gets terminated, essentially. Let's talk a bit about navigation, because this is another tricky thing that took a while to get my head around. In WinJS, if you want to navigate from one page to another, you can't use hrefs, essentially. Since it's a single-page model, navigation is done through through the WinJS API, which you have access to. So you call winjs.navigation.navigate. And in that method, you pass in the path of the HTML page that you want to navigate to, along with any objects that you want access to on that page. So that's how you pass objects from one page to another. So in this case, we could say winjs.navigation.navigate, detailview.html, and that'll navigate from master view to detail view, while keeping sure that both of those are inside this default.html shell. The other thing, so on this slide, this is what happens if we use hrefs. So if you click on a link and it had an href to detail view.html, suddenly that page loads, but there's no shell anymore, right? There's no default.html shell around that page. So that page has no idea it basically has no idea of any WinJS APIs or any on-device APIs at all. So there's no way to navigate back from that page to the previous page, essentially. So we ran into this problem when we were actually doing our unit tests, and we had to correct it by going back to the previous model. So again, to iterate, this is kind of the code that you call to navigate from one page to another. And you can pass in an object, and in the app that I'm going to show you a little later, I pass models from the master view to the detail view using winjs.navigation.navigate. And the navigation namespace has a bunch of other methods, right? So go back, go forward, standard things that you would expect. And when you do that, what happens is the app automatically adds the back buttons and the forward buttons as you would expect, so you don't have to take care of any of that stuff. So I'm going to talk a bit about now the interesting part, which is how we can use YUI and WinJS to build Windows 8 apps. Now this section is actually all going to be about reusing code. That's something that I found out while I was kind of experimenting with this stuff, is because this is a web runtime, we can reuse a lot of existing web code when making Win8 apps. And we can use a lot of existing concepts that we use on the web instead of reinventing the wheel. By this, what I mean is when you traditionally launch a new app in WinJS, just as you would expect from Microsoft, you get a ton of proprietary CSS, which makes no sense. And I had to actually go through and clean up all the CSS and just replace it with nice semantic CSS and CSS3 stuff, which actually works in both environments instead of working just in the Microsoft WinJS environment. And another thing I'll be covering in this section is this user interface, user experience thing, which is this debate comes up sometimes, is that, oh, if I use web technologies, is my app going to be less performant, or is it going to not look as nice? So I'm going to actually show that through examples. So I'm actually going to show you an app, but before I show it to you, because I'm going to show it to you over remote desktop, and it's kind of clunky, it's actually very smooth. I checked it yesterday. I went to the office and I checked it on the machine. It runs really well. But it's kind of clunky because it's over remote desktop. So I wanted to just give you an overview of what kind of the app does so you understand it when I show it to you. So it's a very simple app. It's a master detail app. If you guys know what Dribbble is, it's this place where designers post shots and they get feedback from other designers. So I really like it because it's a nice, colorful site. So I'm using the Dribbble API over YQL. And this is the homepage of the Win8 app that I'm going to show you. Essentially gets a bunch of images from Dribbble, groups them into 3 categories. You can only see 2 here: popular, everyone, and debut. And then you can click on one of these and get a detail view. So what's interesting here is I'm using y.view to make these views here. And they look pretty native, right? So I have some CSS in there, obviously, but they look, you would say this looks pretty native. And then I have a y.model list that contains all of the individual models for all the shots. And then each individual shot is represented as a y.model, essentially, called shot. Now, if you click on one of these, you go to this page, which is another page. And so what I want to make clear here is none of these 2 pages use anything WinJS specific when it comes to their models or their views. They only use WinJS code for their controllers. Now for this page, again, I'm using y.masonry, which is a gallery plugin or a gallery module to create this brick-like effect for the comments so that they kind of stack nicely. And you can vertically scroll through the comments and horizontally scroll through the page. Apart from that, I think I'm using y.view for the other sections. And everything is floated left relative to each other. to create the WinJS sort of UI effect. Now, the other cool thing I want to show you is that I have the same app on, it's not really an app, right? But it's pretty simple, but I have the same code running on Chrome or Firefox, on the browser, essentially. It's the exact same thing, literally the same code. I have a grid view, which shows, again, the items. I have the same model list, which shows the model list of all the shots, and each shot is still represented by a whiteout model. The only thing that's changed here is I completely changed the CSS, because the CSS in Win8 is obviously different from what users expect in a web page. The other thing that I changed is if you click on a shot, I don't show the Win8 sort of UI. I just show a completely different UI. So I just use a completely different view. Instead of using the Win8 view, I just pass in a different view to the controller here. But the models that are getting passed between the master and detail view are exactly the same. So I'm going to show it to you. Again, it looks clunky here when I'm going to scroll around, but that's because of remote desktop. Okay, so here, can you guys see this? Yeah, okay. So here it is, pretty straightforward, right? So I can kind of scroll through like you would in Win8. I'm just using, these are just images that are all kind of floated left relative to each other. There's actually 3 views here. I represent each of these groups. So the everyone group is one view, and then the debut group is another view, and the views are kind of just floated relative to each other. So when I click on, let's say, this, I go to this view here, and just using the standard WinJS navigation, you can see, kind of scroll down through here. So yeah, that's pretty much all it is. I just there's some cleanups that still need to be done, obviously, but you get the idea. And then on the browser, it's pretty much the same thing. The same views. You have 3 different grid views here, and then clicking on one of them basically just shows a very simple overlay. So let me go back in here and talk about how to do this. So if you want to include YUI in a Win8 app, how do you do that? So there are three different ways. One is to use the dependency configurator. So if you go to the dependency configurator on YUILibrary.com, you can choose the modules that you're interested in, and you get a bunch of script files. You can download the script files, because remember, you can't include them remotely, and then you can add them to your project. So you can do that, but it's manual, right? You have to kind of copy-paste script files over, and then if your modules change, you have to figure out new script files to get, so we don't really want to do that. Another way is to clone YUI and include the build and source directories. So this is much nicer, because you can just clone. The problem with that is if you clone the entire library and then include it, I think it's over 120 megs, 130 megs. It's pretty large, so you don't really need all that code. So what I did was I cloned YUI, but I only included the build into the project. And the builder actually comes to, I think, 30 megs of code, which is not bad if you think about an app. You could potentially include only the modules that you need from that build directory, but that was a pretty good, I felt that was pretty nice. Now, if you were including stuff from the gallery, like I did, I included masonry, and I think I included Eric F's model sync YQL. I recommend, now that the new gallery, you can keep your own repos separately. I recommend just cloning those repos and including the build files from there. So just include the build files. That's what I would recommend. And to include YUI, if you remember before how I talked about default.html is kind of the shell for every page in the application, I actually include YUI directly in there, and that gets included into every page, right? It only gets loaded once, because default.html never changes. But that way, I don't have to include it in the HTML pages of every other view in my app. Another interesting thing here is that YUI config. Let me quickly show you actually how my default.html looks like so you'll get a better idea. So, so yeah, at the top here, we have some WinJS references. And then I have this YUIConf global variable, right? If you go to the API, what this does is you don't have to pass in objects when you do YUI use anymore. The config automatically takes care of that. So I use this YUIConf global, and I included all the custom modules that I'm including in this project in here. And so for all my other pages, I can just do YUI.use, call the module. Not sure if there's any con of doing this, but it seemed like a good way to keep everything organized in one place. So all my custom modules are defined here, and I know what they require, and then I can just use them in any other page of my application. And then after that, I include YUI here. And then, as you see, there's not much in this. Everything from all the other views will automatically get appended into this content host div. So after that, let's revisit this MVC architecture that these views use. When I saw this, I immediately thought about the YUI app framework. So remember how each page in a WinJS app has its own HTML, has its own JavaScript, and has its own CSS? We can represent that stuff using the YUI app framework. So we can represent the model for a page using y.model or y.model-list. We can represent the view using y.view, and we can represent the controller is interesting. I'll get to this later, but for now, for the controller, I'm not actually using y.router. For the controller, I'm just keeping it using WinJS conventions and just doing the standard stuff that WinJS expects you to do. So models, I feel, should be environment agnostic, right? They basically represent data, and that doesn't depend on an environment basis. So luckily, since YUI 3.73, we added support for for cores. So WinJS supports cores over XML HTTP request, and the new YQL WinJS module allows it to use cores to talk to the YQL. So YQL just works. And I'll show you my my model code, and you'll see there's no WinJS code in there at all. All it does is load stuff from YQL and save it in a model list. And so that allows this code to run on the browser and on WinJS. If you didn't use this, if you just used whatever was provided to you when you started up the initial project, there was a ton of kind of WinJS specific code in there just to make it work with WinJS views. And I'll get to views in a bit. But let me show you my model list that represents all this stuff. I think I can clean up the code more, but you'll get the idea. So I create a subclass model list, and I just pass in a query, which is a multi-query that goes to YQL. And the cool thing about YQL is you don't have to use a YQL table to use YQL. I'm just using the JSON table, and it's going to query the Dribble API directly, get the JSON back. So it's not like you have to use a YQL table. So it's really nice. I'm using Eric F's model sync YQL module, which allows me to just load, which is called the load method, get YQL results back, and then parse the results out. So then I classify the results that come back into different groups. And essentially, that's it. There's kind of no WinJS specific code in here. And the same applies for the individual shot, which is even smaller. I can probably break this out a bit more, but it's just a standard y.model. So let's talk about views. This is actually really interesting. Should we use WinJS UI views, or should we leverage y.view? So in this image here, we can see a couple of the different UI views that WinJS comes with. There's the list view, which is on the left, the comments that you see. There's a grid view on the right. And you can do some fancy stuff with the grid view. You can say stuff like, I want some items to be bigger than other items, pass in different templates. Which is what they've done there, to have that one image bigger than the rest. So there's some interesting things you can do. I want you to look at something here. Take a look at this. This is using the native grid view implementation in WinJS. It's the most standard grid view that you can get. You basically pass in an array and tell it what to show and what not to show. And then take a look at this. And they look pretty similar. Apart from some CSS differences, one is longer than the other. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. If you notice, the fonts are the same. They pretty much just look exactly the same. This is using y.view. So what's the benefit there? Well, with native views, here are the pros, right? It's easy to get it to look right because that's what so they work with the user interface styles, rules that are provided by Microsoft. So easy to get it to look right. It's also the conventional way to do it. So it's the WinJS way. Microsoft has documentation, has code samples, etc. But let's look at the cons here. You can't use the code outside this environment. These views are proprietary to the environment, and they're only using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript anyway under the hood. The other tricky thing that I ran into is you have to figure out how to organize this native code, the native API code, with the YUI code. So if you have a model list, which you can't pass the model list into a native view. You have to kind of pass in, some alternative functions to tell the native view how to group stuff, and then you also have to pass in only an array. So there's some architecture that you have to do to make sure that your code is at least getting clean. And another con, which doesn't exist on Android or iOS, you could say, is that there's no performance gain for using native views. Again, it's all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript under the hood. So let's compare that with y.view. You can code it once and reuse it in different environments. You could definitely reuse the JavaScript, right? Because that's what I've done. I haven't reused the CSS, which is what determines the styles, but the markup is the same. It works well with YUI, so you can listen to attribute change events. You can pass in model lists, and it kind of just works. The biggest pro here, I think, is achieving the look and feel of Win8 is really easy, because Win8 provides this UI.css file, and it's very easy to figure out what my class names should be to adopt a certain style. And not only that, but since Win8, like the Metro interface by its nature has this flat look and feel, it's actually a lot easier to work with it than in iOS, where you have these gradients that you have to get to look exactly right, and these text shadows. It works really well with CSS. The con here, obviously, is that I have to code and determine the markup and styles. So instead of using a view that was already provided to me, I have to code it. But that's a one-time cost, right? If I code it, so I made a grid view here, and I don't have to ever make one again. And I could add some more functionality to it, but that's relatively trivial compared to making a grid view for a web interface and using a completely different view for the WinJS interface. So to me, I think it depends on the app that you're making. In the end, if you're making something that you don't expect to be cross-platform, you could take the hit and use the native views, because you'll save yourself writing some code. But over the long term, I think y.view probably offers greater benefits, right? So try using both. The other issue I found was that the Microsoft code for the y.view code is really straightforward, right? Get a view, figure out what you want to put into its render method, pass in a model or model list, tell it when you want it to render again based on attribute change events, and it just works. The native view stuff is not that easy. It's pretty tricky. So I don't even know how to explain it very well, to be honest. So try using both, see what you're comfortable with. Just want to make a brief note about controllers. So I actually haven't experimented with y.router in this environment. So right now, my controllers are still using standard, there's no YUI code in there. I mean, there is, but it's heavily leveraging WinJS APIs, which I think is fine, because controllers in my book can be specific based on their environments. Page navigation has to be done using WinJS APIs anyways. And navigation history is already maintained by this navigator.js file that you get for free. So for now, I haven't fooled around with controllers. Maybe I'll change my mind if I do, but for now, I didn't find anything wrong with using the standard stuff that's provided to me by the project. So just touching back on this point about UI and UX, won't user experience suffer if we don't use native APIs? And the key here is that everything is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript anyway. So whether you use native views or not, you're still going to run through a bunch of JavaScript. The standard rules when applying stuff to the DOM and all that still applies in this environment, right? CSS3 transitions are supported. So one of the things that people might say, and I ask myself, is that, well, when views load, there's this subtle animation that kind of happens. These are kind of native animations, and isn't it going to be hard? Like, that's kind of what makes the app feel like it's native, right? And if you don't have those animations, suddenly the app feels kind of clunky because it just kind of pops up at you in different places. I was actually able to replicate those animations using CSS3 and just using the transition module in YUI. Again, since these animations, native animations are using CSS under the hood, they're pretty easy to figure out. And I think they're probably in UI.js, so UI.css. So if you probably went through that UI.css file, you'd probably be able to figure out what's happening under the hood. So on that note, it's really easy to leverage the styles that are in these UI files to get the right look and feel. And the key thing to note here is that your Win8 UI should not look like your web UI. Changing the CSS makes that possible, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to change the HTML and the JavaScript. So I just want to end by talking a little bit about debugging WinJS apps, obviously very important. It's actually not bad. So I can show you guys if I have some time left, but you can set breakpoints and use the JavaScript console for debugging, as you would expect. There's this Windows simulator that you get if you install Visual Studio, and it's very similar to the iOS simulator. So you can simulate touch mode. You can simulate kind of like putting 2 fingers on it. And it also has simulation for different screen resolutions for different sized tablets. So that's nice. And if you actually, when you're in Visual Studio, you can either build locally or build in the simulator. And if you build in the simulator, you can view the DOM while the app is running at certain breakpoints using this DOM Explorer. So it's very nice. So you can use, that's how I figured out a lot of these styles sometimes, is I stopped it and used the DOM Explorer to figure out kind of what's happening and what the hierarchy HTML looks like for some of these native views. So I think that's all I had. If you have any questions or comments, now is a good time. And so the code I showed you is all up on GitHub, so you can check it out. It's on Tilo Mitra/sites. Cool, thanks.
Anyone have any questions? Great.
So I know that some of the advantages to doing a native app are more to do with just getting the vetting and stuff and getting in the App Store. Can you touch on that? Because from the perspective of somebody trying to make a decision of whether to do their app either in web or in WinJS on Windows 8.
So what do you mean by the difference between web and Windows 8? Are you...
So doing their, say like, I don't know, do they have like some way to make your app like a bookmarklet, like on iOS, where you can tap an icon. You can go to like a web page that has an icon. It'll make a bookmark essentially, which will turn into an icon on your home screen.
Oh, I see. To be honest, I don't know if that functionality exists. I mean, I haven't read into Win8 as an operating system too much.
Well, there's an app store, right?
Yeah, there's an app store. So
yeah,
So these apps are meant to be packaged and submitted directly to the App Store as an app. If you're talking about more of a web page that you want to place on a home screen, I'm not sure if the OS supports that. I assume it does. I assume you can favorite stuff onto the start menu.
So are you saying that there's more than WinJS is not the only way to go through the actual App Store?
So for sure there are two ways, right? There's the WinJS way, which is meant more for web developers, and then there's the C# way, meant for traditional developers. And I think what Microsoft tried to do there is to prevent the iOS problem, which was in iOS, web developers often make a web app and then add it to home screen. And I think Microsoft's saying if you want to do that, make it using WinJS. But I can't speak to the fact whether you can actually add it to the home screen from the web browser. I assume you can, but that's an assumption.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi.
Hey.
Out of curiosity, did you dig deep into, is Microsoft writing now their own low-level DOM manipulation, animation stuff? Because I heard, actually quite a while ago that Microsoft was going to invest in maybe adopt, quote-unquote, jQuery. So do you know what's under the hood?
I haven't looked into the files, but I mean, it's pretty easy to look into them. When I looked into them briefly, I just saw regular sort of straight up DOM stuff. There wasn't any library or normalization there at that level. And for the CSS side, as I said, there were a lot of WinJS and Win8 in specific. For these native apps, they have a lot of custom CSS. So they have stuff like grid rows, which they're CSS that don't even apply in IE10, for example, right? They're just specific to this environment. They have a lot of proprietary, like custom stuff like that. I haven't noticed anything that's like any sort of normalization layer. Even in the documents, I haven't noticed anything like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey Tilo,
Hey.
I was curious if you thought that the conceptual mapping between router and the way that it works with like paths and callbacks maps well to the native WinJS navigation stuff, with the sense like, would it make sense for us to invest time into making router essentially work on top of either the browser history APIs or the navigation stuff in WinJS?
Yeah, so I totally think that's what we should look into. Like, I actually think that's the way to go, because then we'd have a better story to tell potentially. The thing is, we could make router work, but what you get for free, which is important, is the whole history management and the UI that comes with that history management, right? We have to figure out how to roll that into whiteout router as well for this environment. But if you could have some submodule that does that, essentially duplicate, but add on to the functionality provided by this native navigator.js file, then yeah, and that would allow us to even better work with models and control and views and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I think if we could share route handling code, if it made sense to, that would be interesting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Any other questions for Tilo? All right, thank you, Tilo.
Thank you, guys.